Look at this opening moment from Over the Garden Wall.
But I think the very worst name for this frog is...
Wait a second. Craig? Where are we?
And then look at the ending of that same chapter.
I'm gonna call him Wirt.
That's gonna be really confusing.
No, I'm gonna call you Kitty.
What? Maybe I'll start calling you Candy Pants.
Whoa, yeah! Good one, Wirt.
Thanks.
I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to Wirt.
And that first clip, Over the Garden Wall, tells us and shows us that we are in a hostile place. And through that first episode, we see that hostility come to bear. A dark, foreboding forest, ominously dark turtles, strange talking birds, mysterious and threatening strangers, and a monster as gluttonous as Cerberus himself.
Beautiful eyes.
But at the end, despite the danger never really abating, they're still just as lost as they ever were. The two characters walk under an overwhelming moon, and the forest that envelops them reminds us that it's both a seemingly inescapable foe and an astoundingly beautiful world. The tension between opposing concepts is a portion of the recipe that makes Over the Garden Wall extremely successful. It's something that TV shows and video games and books and anything that tells stories has attempted to do over and over and over, which is just to build a world that we love. This cartoon successfully pulls off this difficult task, giving us this world that is both threatening and achingly beautiful. And it treads this careful path that artists and storytellers have attempted to do for ages. This is how Over the Garden Wall builds a dreadful and compelling world that we love. I'm Jordan Holt. I'm an illustrator and a professor, and I examine animation, illustration, and art with all the seriousness that I would direct towards the art historical past. Also, for those who have been saying that this red microphone is too distracting in the video frame, I have heard you. So at crucial moments in the video, I'm going to be including an even more red microphone to direct your attention where it should go in the frame. I was introduced to Over the Garden Wall only a few years ago, and now it has become annual October viewing for myself and my unspecified large number of children. In an era of television where typically I watch 2 to 3 episodes of a show and then move on with no regrets, what is it about Over the Garden Wall that makes it stick? There's so many things that I could list, but I'm going to focus on this video just on the one thing, building a world. I focus on this one because Over the Garden Wall is particularly good at it, but also because I know from experience just how difficult this is to do. Like most people who were my age when The Lord of the Rings came out, which was middle school, after I read and saw The Lord of the Rings, I tried to write my own fantasy knockoff novel. I spent a lot of time making maps and inventing alphabets and designing economic and agricultural history of this world that I was building. But in the end, it was just flat. And even today, I have 30,000 words of a bad novel stuck on a floppy disk in a box somewhere. It was called The Stone of Dragorth. And that in of itself should let you know the quality of what I was putting together. Making a world that your audience wants to return to time and time again is one of the earmarks of great fantasy and science fiction. So let's look closely at Over the Garden Wall and see if we can uncover just some of the methods that lead to the magnificence.
Hey, you two robbers, you're under arrest. Just kidding, happy Halloween.
And one caveat before we go in, I'm not really going to talk very much about music.
Here, Miss Langtree, play something like this.
Simply because I don't know anything about it. I'm going to go ahead and say right now that it's wonderful and that it's a huge part of the show, but I'm going to leave the discussion of that topic to the educators and professionals with expertise in that area. Instead, I'm going to focus on the visual and the narrative elements that accomplish the goal, especially because I'm always thinking about my core medium of storytelling, which is comics. Even without the music, though, I think I pinned down 4 clear methods that the creators and animators used to build this world of Over the Garden Wall. And then after that, aside from methods, I'm just going to tell you what I think makes the world of this animation so particularly beautiful. Method number 1, the environment is integrated into the plot. Look at this moment at the beginning of episode 3. The characters are walking along and they're dealing with their interpersonal conflicts, and suddenly they're presented with this schoolhouse and the children are called into the schoolroom.
Greg?
Excuse me? Please take your seat, children. You're late. You know the rules. Once the bell has rung, class has begun.
The entire plot of the episode follows from that simple call, which is presented by the world in which they are walking. I mentioned this at the start of the video, and it's one of those techniques that's extremely obvious in hindsight. I do firmly believe that most of great art is a combination of the painfully obvious choice intertwined with the intensively acquired skill. This method fits perfectly into that notion. From the opening line, we're told that traversing this world is the task. Our characters are lost. This place and its many eccentricities are the source of conflict for our characters. Though my favorite obvious example of this is stepping on pumpkins and finding yourself in this village where the destruction of pumpkins leads to...
I sentence you to a few hours of manual labor.
Wait, what?
The things that they encounter constantly in this world hinder them from the overarching task of their escape, their return home. And so the world creates the plot of each episode by the things the characters encounter along that journey. This is a classic method of storytelling, and frequently it leads to richer and more developed worlds. The basic structure of the story is like The Hobbit, or Dante's Divine Comedy, or Avatar, The Last Airbender. There may be an overarching task which has to be accomplished, but the world that we journey through provides the texture and the conflict that fills the narrative and illuminates the characters as they are and as they are becoming.
Though I am lost, my wounded heart resides back home, in pieces strewn about the graveyard of my lost love.
I have a particular love for journey stories, and as a writer I do love the serendipity that arises when each idea that enriches your plot so directly enriches the world that you're building. Method number 2, the world is characterized through thematic boundaries. So during the show, we visit the mansion of a wealthy and eccentric tea magnate. We ride on a riverboat with well-dressed, music-loving frogs. We inhabit a dream straight out of a 1920s cartoon. We escape the beast in the old grist mill and are serenaded by the townsfolk at the local tavern. The world of Over the Garden Wall has boundaries drawn around its possibilities. I frequently mention both to my students and on this channel that restrictions are crucial to creativity. Just like in music, which again, I know nothing about. The limitations of which notes we use in a given key enable the harmonies that give music its beauty. The limitations we draw around our world prevent chaos. The world of Over the Garden Wall is permeated by the time period of the 19th and the early 20th centuries. It contains elements that you'd find in things like The Wind and the Willows. It charms and saddens us in equal measure because it limits itself to this principle of dusk, the presence of both dark and light, but that's the thing we'll talk more about at the end, so stay for that. I don't want to waste that one here by conflating it with a different concept. Suffice it to say that for the world to become a character, it cannot be everything, or capable of everything. Just like a character, it must be given a nature that promotes some behaviors and it restricts and prohibits others. And this is enabled by its boundaries. Method number 3, different places and loose ends. Do you remember this guy?
Maybe he's simple.
No, I'm just lost. See, we're trying to get to...
I'm the highwayman.
Okay, good to know. Well, so you see...
I'm the highwayman.
That's the highwayman. And the highwayman is one of my favorite parts of the show. And one of the reasons I love the highwayman is because I know nothing about the highwayman. And I really can't defend the presence of the highwayman.
I make ends meet. Just like any man, I work with my hands. If you cross my path, I'll knock you out.
You could take him out of the plot, and nothing would be lost logically. But yet so much would be lost otherwise. The Highwayman builds the world because the Highwayman makes the world feel big. And this is one of the mistakes I see constantly in both independent works and in big-budget studio work. The real world is peppered with loose ends. Things and people exist in the world that insert themselves into our real stories, without any real connection to the plot or its outcomes. But rather than an outright distraction, these things are demonstrations that although we don't follow every rabbit trail, there's rabbit trails everywhere. Over the Garden Wall resists the temptation to make everything come to fruition at the end of the story. Many things should and do, because a story should be coherent. And there's few things better than seeing something early in the narrative become unexpectedly important at the end. But there also has to be this balance with loose ends that are not explained, because when everything is explained, or when everything connects to the plot, the world shrinks. And one of my biggest complaints about fantasy in the modern age is that the world feels so small. We need highwaymen to just drop by, and we need hints of a frog economy that includes record contracts. We need a family cursed to be bluebirds without the mechanisms of that magic explained. We need a talking horse with a penchant for theft.
Fred's a talking horse. He can do whatever he wants.
I want to steal.
Without really knowing why. And sometimes we need a school to help animals read and write without understanding in the slightest why such a thing would matter. The different people and the places in the unexplored path make the world feel big. This principle holds tension with the one that I just mentioned. Hard thematic boundaries are drawn. But within that framework, the different, the unexpected, and the inexplicable can be balanced with the logic of the narrative. And it is a balancing act. Harmony is the consequence of two opposing elements in balance. Unity, when things have a shared relationship, and variety, when difference is introduced. If unity becomes too dominant, the world becomes extremely stale and repetitive. If variety becomes too dominant, the world loses coherence. Method number 4, restraint and yield. This one is kind of hard to describe. You'll see elements of it in things we've already mentioned. But let's think of a particular moment. Do you remember the old cat hunt?
Hey, I got an idea. Let's play Two Old Cat. Do you guys know how to play Two Old Cat? Here we go. Here's one old cat.
See, that's really weird. That's a weird moment. There's a lot of these things sprinkled throughout the show, and most of them overlap with the previously asserted notion of loose ends, like the highwayman, but maybe less the highwayman, and more the way the highwayman dances.
I'll knock you out, drag you off the road, steal your shoes from off your feet, and then highwayman, when I'm making
It's wild stuff, but it applies to something that I began to notice years ago, and I think might be the most important artistic principle that I've noticed and started to integrate into my own work, and I call it restraint and yield. I first noticed it because I was watching Steven Spielberg movies from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I love his 1971 film, Duel. I saw it on TV as a kid and I loved it, and Jurassic Park was my favorite film as a kid. I watched it incessantly. However, I never really enjoyed the films that Spielberg made after the turn of the century in quite the same way. They were solid filmmaking, maybe even technically better in many ways, but they lacked a kind of messy enthusiasm that the earlier work retained. And I started to wonder even if when people say, I prefer this band, artist, filmmaker, writer's early stuff, maybe they're not just being pretentious. Maybe there's something positive that happens when you're young and undisciplined that kind of disappears as you age. And after many years of thinking about this, here's what I think it is. When you're young, you're struggling to figure out what makes good creative work, so you tend to throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. You try things because they seem right to you, not necessarily because you can rationally defend it. The process of making something is just too messy for that. So a lot of eccentric stuff makes its way into the work that isn't necessarily defensible at a rational level. By the time you're older, you have a much clearer idea of what is rationally necessary, and the process of creating is less messy than it was. It's more structured in your mind. So you tend to leave things out that are rationally indefensible. And for good reason, too. I mean, too much of that irrationality and the work becomes unhinged, indigestible, and incomprehensible to the audience. However, a little bit of that irrationality is like seasoning, and maybe you should deliberately include it in your story and in the worlds that you build. So the decision to make a giant and hideous turkey slump its head on the table in an empty house is not a rational decision.
Anyone here? Hello? Oh, sorry. I'm looking for a phone. I'm sorry.
Nor does it rationally serve the story. But without it, something somewhat indiscernible is lost. A naked frog that suddenly discovers a beautiful singing voice has minimal narrative utility.
Over the treetops and mountains, over the blackened ravines.
Other options are available that would have raised fewer questions and frankly made more sense. But what an unforgettable moment that it makes. Here's the principle in a nutshell. Your story and your artwork has to be reasonable, sensible, and comprehensible as a whole. It has to be a nutritious meal for the person who sits down to eat. So you create the fundamentals and you structure that story with restraint. But you season it with yield. Yield to eccentricity and sprinkle in the nonsense that you can't defend. Allow some impulse to find its way into the structure. I mean, there is a reason why I keep sticking that red microphone up all over the place. I just thought it was funny. And the video doesn't need it. I just thought it was funny. This, I think, is the way that all of life works. If I say to a class of my students, let's do something different today, it carries no weight unless there's something standard that we do. A moment that subverts the standard means nothing unless the standard exists. Living a life in rebellion to any kind of norm, cultural norms, moral norms, etc., loses all of its zest unless most of the population is faithfully upholding that thing. The flavor of the world is built on restraint and yield. And even though I know nothing about music, a moment of Claude Debussy gains so much more power when we overthrow the serenity he sensibly builds and decline into a spiral of dizzying notes. But that's it. That's the four applicable methods of world building that I see that could be used in a variety of other things. But now what if we just ask a more fundamental question? Over the Garden Wall's world so beautiful. And this is my favorite question to ask because there's probably plenty of answers you could give. But the one I think is the best answer, and the one that I enjoy to ponder so much, is how this world and this piece of animation holds joy and sorrow together in tension. See, this is a story that's immersed in twilight, in those last beautiful moments when the sun has nearly set and the eaves of the woods collect these deep and impenetrable shadows. It's one of the most beautiful moments in the natural cycle of the world, but it also carries a tinge of sadness with it, as it heralds the irrevocable passing of a day. Over the Garden Wall touches this sensation of twilight again and again through its visuals that mimic the light at the end of the day. There's this dark shadow that appears in the sky as the sun sinks lower. It's a lighting effect that you could find in the Venetian Renaissance work of Paolo Veronese. A sky hinting at the blue and the beautiful, but by its darkness of value, it betrays this passage into night. And we see this at the seasonal level too, as the autumn setting of this world carries that same sensation of the passage and the end of something. Trees on the verge of death shedding their last vestiges of joyous life that they held throughout the spring and the summer. In the tavern, we see this close-knit community of workers, but the sense we get from their song is the sadness of decay as their community dries up and it dies. Not enough work to keep each of them doing the labor by which they define themselves. This does recall for me the work of Edward Hopper, particularly this painting of the lighthouse. which is so cold and bleak and beautiful, equal parts unwelcoming and alluring. And Over the Garden Wall strikes this balance as well. For all of its bleak references to the passing of things, it incessantly reaches out for hope. Because the beauty we see in the oncoming darkness comes from our hope of a redemptive grace that's built into the foundations of the world. Sorrow and loss, they bring about this special species of beauty. And it doesn't wash away the sadness. Instead, it builds a foundation for future joy. By the river of Babylon we sat and we wept as we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps in the willows because our captors demanded songs of joy. But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? That's from Psalm 137. See, sorrow makes the beauty we recall from joyful moments feel impossible. It's so distant. We're not able to sing songs of joy, so we hang our harps in the willows. But a harp hanging in a willow tree is in of itself a beautiful thing of a different kind. And that's what Over the Garden Wall manages so subtly and sweetly to touch. The beauty of a harp hanged in a willow. The good things that come from the tragic and the terrible things seem self-contradictory and rightfully impossible. And yet our lives give us example after example after example of just that. See, dawn is coming, and the passage into night that twilight tells is not a final ending. And the fact that it's not final, that even when something is truly sad, and that the passing of something is rightfully grieved, there comes with it an understanding that it's not the end. And it makes it a little bit easier to say when you encounter a truly terrible moment.
Ain't that just the way?
If you like this video, interact with it to trigger the algorithm. Let it know that you were here. Like and subscribe. Comment and tell me what you like best about Over the Garden Wall. There's way more to mine than what I have put here. And if you're interested in seeing any of my illustration work, I put links down in the description for the graphic novels that I produce and for the card game that I'm currently working on that's based on Greek mythology. And hopefully I'll see you in another video. Look right here.